kings and queens. Welcome to Faith Helps Podcast, and I am your host, Diamond Booth. And I love you guys. I hope you feel all this lovey-dovey mushiness squishing through your speakerphone or your phone, whatever you're listening on. And I hope that it just surrounds you with a big old warm, cozy hug. Okay. So you either feel really loved right now or totally creeped out. Either way, I'm sure it comes as no surprise because today is February the 1st. Okay, the month that we nationally recognize as a month of love because of Valentine's Day. Even though we should be walking in and practicing attributes of love every day, regardless of a holiday. But nevertheless, here we are. So during February, everyone is talking about love and dating and relationships, gifts, decorations. Even in the stores, it's literally everywhere. Just when I went to Target, it was like Love Bomb Fest. Literally everywhere you turn, there's pink and red, hearts and stuffed animals, flowers and chocolate assortments. It honestly can get a little overwhelming. And in more recent years, there's also been this like huge push for self-love, loving yourself, loving your flaws, embracing the fullness of all you got to offer, admiring your own beauty, taking yourself on dates and spoiling yourself, putting yourself first. The list goes on. And nothing is wrong with any of that. You should love yourself to an extent. I'm sure that's not what you guys were expecting me to say, especially since I say love yourself at the end of almost all of my videos, live streams, and episodes. That was like my tagline for the longest. Love yourself, guys. But today, I'm not saying that. As you may have noticed, this episode is actually titled Die to Self. I bet nobody clapped for that, but I said what I said. Die to self. Okay, so hear me out. Stick around to the end of this episode. I'm willing to bet I can win you over as we dive into this topic. And if not, go on, tell me if you kick rocks. Deal? Okay. By now, you all know I thoroughly enjoy exploring the meanings of things. So let's just start there. What do I mean when I say die to self? What does it even mean to die to self? How do we do that? Well, this is actually a common phrase used in church. Even though it's not explicitly stated in the Bible, the concept of dying to self stems from what is actually a way of communicating what it means to accept Christ into our lives and live a life in alignment with God. So remember last week I shared about my baptism, right? And I told you guys how baptism represents a death. I said the death of our old selves and the birth of our new selves. We're reborn again, so to speak. Well, when we accept God into our lives, we are not just making the decision to put to death our old ways, mentalities, behaviors. When we make that precious decision to walk in alignment with God, we are also agreeing to pick up our own cross. If you don't understand what that means, think about what happened when Jesus picked up his cross. Spoiler alert, it did not end well. And that's a huge understatement. He died a brutal death. I mean, ultimately, it did end well because he conquered the cross, death, hell, and the grave. And there was a huge, enormous bonus in it for all of us. But I've already spilled too much of the tea. Just go dust off that KJV and get to reading, boo. You got a lot to catch up on, okay? Now, the point is, when it comes to our faith, we have to make the decision to die to self. Through baptism, our old selves die as we rise up from the water or are reborn as our new self in Christ. But then we have to bear our own cross. This, on the other hand, is not a one-time thing. Yeah, It's actually a lifelong, daily, everyday death. As we continue to make the choice each day to love God more than we love our precious little selves. That means to walk as Christ did, to live a life that honors Him, to live a life in alignment with God's values and expectations of us. That looks like choosing to forgive instead of getting even. It looks like fessing up instead of covering up, apologizing instead of making excuses. It looks like declining that 7th shot of Hennessy instead of saying YOLO and blacking out. It looks like speaking positivity instead of gossiping and talking down about others. It looks like fasting instead of being fast. You know what it looks like? It looks like taking a cold shower instead of hitting up your sneaky link. I know. None of that sounds fun at all. Trust me. Whoo, child. Trust. Oh, Lord, trust me. I know. It's so much easier to say than do. And I'm still struggling with it. Besides, why would we want to do any of that stuff anyway? That doesn't sound fun, right? Why would we make all of these sacrifices and others every single day? Say what? I'll tell you. It's because of love. Because Jesus did it. Because He loves us. He loved us before we were even born. Again, for God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. Love requires sacrifice. And this doesn't just apply to our faith and spirituality. It also applies to one of the biggest factors that impact our mental health: relationships. I started this episode today from this deeply spiritual perspective because what better way to start this month about love and relationships than to first recognize the one who is love and desires a relationship with us. If you don't have that relationship straight, you don't need to be worried about any other relationship. We can't talk about love, and we can't truly nor rightfully love not ourselves, let alone someone else, without God's love. Unfortunately, it doesn't always pan out that way for many of us. Might I say most of us. For many of us, it is the relationships we encounter here on earth from the moment we exit our mother's wombs that shape how we perceive, experience, show up in every other relationship thereafter. And depending on your upbringing, you may never even know the importance of having a relationship with God first. And even then, sometimes we still get it wrong. I was raised in church, went to Christian school my whole life, had a relationship with God throughout middle school and even until now, and still miserably fumbled in my relationships. Like, it was like face plant, like horrible, just crash and burn, flames everywhere, explosions, fireworks, all of it. Romantic partners, friends, family included. And even to this day, I still don't always get it 100% right all of the time. I've accepted that I'm not perfect. I try to be, try to get better. I recognize my areas of growth and improvement, and I work on them. I try to be intentional about them. And yeah, we don't always get it right. And I think that's a reason why God does give us so much grace and mercy when it comes to relationships. He knows we need them, and He knows that He designed us to have a desire for them. And He knows that because He gave us free will, there would be times when we completely allow that desire to cloud our judgment and discernment in relationships. And that is why being in partnership, or shall I say relationship with God, can be a game changer. He gives you the cheat codes to navigate some of those natural human problems that arise in relationships. And yet, because of free will, there will still be times that we encounter problems in our relationships because no one is perfect. One of the major reasons people come to therapy is because of relationships. I'm tempted to say that almost all of the reasons people come to therapy relate back to a relationship in their life in some way, shape, form, or another. They come into therapy because of love or lack thereof in their intimate relationships. They come because of relationships that caused pain and trauma, whether from strangers, romantic partners, family, or friends, or people that they thought were friends. They come because of mommy issues or daddy issues. Or there are things that they want to unlearn from the relationships that they grew up watching and observing. They are wanting to learn how to manage their relationships better or how to get out of unhealthy relationships, which isn't always easy. They come because of conflicts in their friendships or with roommates or colleagues, which is all examples of relationships. And they come because of how patterns in relationships have impacted their current functioning. For example, like how they see themselves based on what they were told growing up. For example, if you were growing up in a household where you were constantly told you weren't smart enough, as an adult, that seed that was planted in your mind and heart has had opportunity to grow and fester and turn into a forest, quite honestly. And so then you're constantly battling this internal feeling of not being enough or not being smart enough, not being good enough. All of the insecurities that come up. Another example is if you grew up in a household where there was a lot of arguing between your parents or guardians, and you just constantly see the yelling and the shouting and the screaming, it might impact you later on as you grow up and you recognize that you're sensitive or you are triggered or you feel very scared and uncomfortable whenever you're around someone yelling or just simply increasing their tone. Not necessarily out of anger, but something internally relates it back to anger because that's what you associate a higher tone of voice with. And then alternately, sometimes people who grow up in those environments grow up and then find out or realize later that they are mirroring what they observed as a child in their current relationships with their current spouses or friends. If they observed any arguments being resolved by cursing each other out, they resolve their current friendships and relationships by cursing them out and then wonder why it doesn't work. And oftentimes we don't have the insight to know that that's what it's connected to, and that's why therapy can be helpful because you have someone on the outside that's looking in and can help you draw lines to the different dots that are all up there in your brain and may not make sense, but they come up in some shape, way, or form. Whether through triggers, memories, or just common patterns that you keep noticing coming up in your relationships. Patterns of abandonment in relationships can lead someone to have anxious attachment or social anxiety and low self-esteem or depression and isolation. If they constantly feel like someone's going to leave, you might find that they're constantly trying to seek reassurance that you're not going to leave. Or someone who struggles with noticing that they've constantly been betrayed in relationships, they tend to have trust issues. So there are plenty more reasons I could list, but I think you get the point, which is that relationships impact us. They impact our mental health. This is why all month long, for the month of February, we'll be focusing on all aspects of relationships. Not just all the lovey-dovey, mushy gushiness, but relationships and love holistically and realistically. Because sometimes we glamorize and romanticize relationships, and then we lose passion for allowing them to actually thrive, and we settle for them crashing and burning. So, of course, we'll talk about dating, but also we'll talk about wisdom in dating. We'll talk about rejection as well as knowing your self-worth. In addition to friendships, boundaries in relationships such as with family, and we certainly cannot skip over having an honest conversation about healing and recovery and overcoming trauma and hurts when it comes to relationships. That's something that I'm personally very passionate about, whether it's trauma, hurts, and pain from a partner, a friend, a family member, or a colleague. It's important to talk about, because if we don't resolve that hurt and that trauma and that pain, then we tend to pass it along into our next relationship. We tend to go in cycles of the same thing and not seeing any change. We'll try to touch a little bit on all of it, but we had to start here with sacrifice, because I truly believe that there is no true love without some form of sacrifice. I also believe that healthy relationships flourish and thrive most only when all parties are willing to make sacrifices for one another. This might sound a bit foreign to our current world order and generation. Culture glamorizes and quite honestly drools over excessive self-love. Yes, I said excessive self-love. Diamond, what are you talking about? How could you excessively love yourself? Yes, you can. You can be so in love with yourself to the point that you are no longer considerate of others, that you're blind to the ways that your behaviors, your actions, your statements are impacting other people. Sometimes we get so enthralled and focused and blinded by this idea of self-love that we forget that part of self-love includes relationships. That's often where we get our perspective of when and how and to the extent to love ourselves based off of how other people treat us or did not treat us. So it's all interwoven, it's all interconnected. But I felt like we had to start here with dying to ourselves, primarily because of the necessity for us to stop highlighting and putting our own self-love on a pedestal over the need to care about the well-being of others. And when I say well-being, I'm not just talking about like charity and caring about the disasters that are impacting other people and those misfortunate. I mean about the people that are sitting right beside you. Do you love them? And do you actually know what it means to love them? Are you willing to sacrifice? Let's actually go into what I mean when I say love requires sacrifice. There are different types of sacrifice, okay? So energy, time, attention, space, finances, resources, those are all things that we sacrifice in relationships. And we don't always realize it. But whether you like the person you're around or you don't, there's some type of sacrifice that is involved. You know, living a aligned life with God can be such a challenge because of the sacrifices that are required, right? Now think about it when it comes to our relationships. When you are in a relationship, there are certain sacrifices like the ones that I just named that you make to make the relationship work. For instance, men may sacrifice guys' night for a paint and sip with Bay. Or ladies may sacrifice getting the latest Sephora beauty collection to get those new Air Jordans that their boo thing has been raving about for the past few months. Even in our friendships, we make sacrifices. Perhaps you have had to sacrifice a few hours of sleep late in the midnight hour to be a listening ear for your best friend as she vents about her no good boyfriend for the 600th time. And mothers sacrifice their hourglass frame, boom, 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 Cocoballa shape for their unborn child as their child is growing and developing within them. That is a huge sacrifice. Even beyond parents, a mentor sacrifices his alone time to teach and advise his mentees. Regardless of the nature of the relationship, every relationship that we find ourselves in requires some form of sacrifice. Time, money, energy, comfort, health, even our sanity, to be quite honest. We make these sacrifices for the sake of the relationship, and we often don't think twice about it. In some of these relationships, the outcomes may be a stronger marriage, a closer parent-child bond, or friendships full of accountability and support. However, not all relationships are good for us, and some of those sacrifices cost us. We're ultimately left drained and feeling empty while they move on with their lives without extending a single thank you or a mere apology for the toll that they had on us. Despite the costly sacrifices, we continue to remain in these unhealthy cycles of relationships, and if we are honest with ourselves, we are not benefiting or growing from them in any way. So that also begs the question, why are we so willing to make such detrimental sacrifices in unhealthy relationships, yet withhold ourselves from a relationship with God? Sometimes what I see happens is that we ultimately love ourselves too much. We love ourselves more than God. And it shows up in how we also treat others. A lot of times we get so focused on what's best for us, and I also blame media for this, that we stop to consider how might we be able to improve in the way that we, yes, love ourselves, but also show that love to other people. Maybe that means that instead of having the last word, you decide to sit and listen. That's what sacrifice looks like. And honestly, that's healthy for you too. That's you showing love to yourself, because you don't need to get your cortisol levels all raised up and getting in a tussie because you're angry and you're wanting to prove a point, instead of hearing what the other person has to say and nurturing that relationship. When we nurture our other relationships, we're also nurturing ourselves. And throughout this entire month, I want us to be able to talk about all these things, because it's not easy. It's not easy to find a balance between self-love and love for others and love for God. It's not easy to make that decision every day to sacrifice what you want to do in order to, whether it be to please God or to please your loved one and your spouse. Sometimes it can feel like a literal fight with your flesh, because we want to do what we want to do. Honestly, as humans, we're selfish by nature. And oftentimes, if that's never corrected or acknowledged, we can find ourselves making a lot of selfish decisions and leaving a lot of burnt bridges behind us. I've always been an advocate for not burning a bridge. If you can avoid it, avoid it. Because you never know how you might meet that person, or you might need to walk back across that bridge, or how that person might need you. That's the beauty in sacrifice, is that it's not always about what we need and what we get. It's also about what we can give. And maybe you're thinking, why? Why should I care what I give? Why does it matter? Now, from a faith perspective, I could certainly say it matters because that's what God called us to do. To love others. Now, outside of the faith perspective, honestly, it's just wise to not burn bridges and to actually care about other people. I've worked with a lot of people in therapy who found themselves alone and isolated because they had these constant toxic patterns of choosing to prioritize themselves over others, and it resulted in burnt bridges. For example, making financial decisions without considering how it's going to impact their partner because they say, quote, "It's my money, I can do what I want with it." Yeah, well, when you're in a relationship, there are certain things that you sacrifice. You sacrifice just getting up and doing what you want with your money for actually talking with your partner about how whatever investment or purchase you're about to make is going to impact them too. I'm sure you would love to get the new Mercedes. However, have you talked to your partner about how that's going to financially impact some of the goals that you guys had together? Don't assume. There are a lot of underlying reasons why a certain decision that you may think is best for you isn't always best for the people around you. And a lot of times, to be quite honest, the people around us have a little bit more insight. They have the advantage of being able to see us from an objective point of view. They have the ability to be able to see the outside. And sometimes people see the future that we're not always taking in consideration when we make some of these decisions. Because for us, oftentimes we're thinking about the here and now. Now, yes, sometimes with most people as they mature, they're able to think about the long-term implications of decisions. But not all of us have mastered that. And not all of us do that accurately, especially depending on how bad you want or are desiring whatever it is that you're seeking or pursuing or think about purchasing. So it can be helpful to talk with other people. And outside of finances, when it comes to attention, when you are stewarding a relationship, whether it be with a mentee or someone who's looking up to you, big brother, little sister program, whatever it may be, you're making a sacrifice because you care about the well-being of that person. You care about being a good role model. Sure, you might want to be looked up to. However, a part of you also cares about what you're communicating to that person and seeing how it grows and flourishes in their life later. I encourage you to take a moment to sit back and actually look at some of the decisions you make. Look at some of the sacrifices you make or have not made and maybe should make. Now, of course, think about them from a wise perspective, considering whether or not the relationships that you're making the sacrifices in are healthy or unhealthy. As I said, we often make unhealthy relationships a constant cycle because we're making sacrifices that are detrimental to our calling, our purpose, our identity, our sanity, our health, our physical health, our mental health, our emotional health, our finances. And yet they are destroying and killing us. They're parasitic. So think about these things over the next couple of days. As you go into this weekend, pay a little bit more attention to the type of sacrifices you are or are not making. Pay attention to what extent you are making those decisions to die to self. Just like the examples I gave, that might look like choosing to encourage someone instead of criticizing them and tearing them down. Or it may also look like dying to yourself by not getting blackface drunk and choosing to take your behind home and take some time to work and reflect on you, or spend time with that sibling that you've been avoiding because we just don't have anything in common. What sacrifices can you make to die to self this weekend and going into next week? As we kick off this month, I really want us to be intentional and strategic about how we keep in mind this focus of dying to self. In other words, making sacrifices and not being selfish, not being so self-focused, but also being able to make wise decisions in our healthy relationships. And we'll talk about how these intertwine and relate to all those other aspects of love and relationships. The trauma, the healing, the growth, the dating, all of that included. What's something better than a gift of chocolates and flowers that you can give someone this month? Not just on Valentine's Day. What's something you could sacrifice to show and exemplify what it means to love? Until next time, love on somebody who needs it most. Someone who is in need of you to show up in their lives. And remember, faith helps.